Welcome to Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook, a podcast that cuts through the noise to explain what's really happening in our democracy. Each episode breaks down key issues with insight from policy experts and change makers, giving you clear tips to take action. Whether you're fired up or feeling stuck, you're in the right place to get informed and get inspired, because democracy works best when we all participate. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Democracy Does, the Civic Power Playbook. Today, we are really lucky to have a terrific professor with us, Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield. She is the professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. She's done extensive research on racial and gender inequality in the workplace. Her work is often referenced when policy experts are examining labor practices as well as gender and diversity initiatives. Dr. Wingfield, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So many questions to start because a lot has been happening with recent policies in terms of the labor market. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the Trump administration has implemented a number of policies that are really going to harm a large portion of the labor pool. And it looks like a lot of rights are going to be taken away. Can you talk about that? And also, what does that mean specifically for people of color in the labor force?
Right. So I have to think about where to begin because there are so many policies that this administration has implemented that have been really destructive. But I think I want to start with the gutting of the federal workforce, which has really been widespread, far-ranging, and often done with little foresight and little advanced thinking about what the implications are going to be of cutting so many civil service workers from so many positions. We have seen cuts across the federal workforce, kind of across the board. USAID has pretty much been demolished, but there have been cuts to other federal agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Education, and so forth. People may think that these types of jobs are ones that don't affect them, but if you look at the data of which types of jobs are actually being cut, these are kind of basic things that we need to have a functioning society. These are people who check to make sure that companies are using the best types of mitigation efforts to make sure that there are not pesticides in our food. These are people who make sure that veterans get the services that they need to make sure that they have the mental health support that can be essential when returning from combat. But what people may not realize is that in many cases, the civil service and federal workforce is disproportionately comprised of people of color, particularly Black workers. And so this type of gutting of the federal workforce has a multiplicative effect. It means that as American citizens, we are dealing with an environment, a work environment, a safety environment, a regulatory environment that's less robust, that is less safe, that has consequences for our health, for our safety, for the food we eat, for the water that we drink, for the cars that we ride in, for the planes that we fly in, for the places that we go. But it also means that Black workers are paying a disproportionate brunt of these ill-conceived decisions to try to gut this workforce because we're seeing higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of layoffs, higher rates of being pushed out of the workforce for Black workers who are disproportionately in these types of jobs.
On the whole, I'm glad you mentioned that because there is this myth that it doesn't matter.
Right.
Oh, what do they just do in Washington? Nobody knows what they do. So I appreciate you clarifying. And I may have to have you on another time because I would love to dive deeper. There's so much to cover. And I don't think people understand how many parts of their lives having those positions eliminated will affect them.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I also want to ask you, you spoke about the federal workforce, but according to the administration, to this report that I read, I just referenced the Economic Policy Institute, they've also gone out of their way to diminish workers' rights by targeting certain people in leadership. For example, the firing of the National Labor Relations Board member, Gwen Wilcox. By the way, I read that apparently that firing was illegal. That was done without any oversight. And she advocated for workers' rights in the private sector.
Right.
So can you just talk about that dynamic? What does that mean symbolically, practically?
Can you expound on that?
Yes, and I wasn't going to start there, but I actually was thinking about that example as well.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So the work that government agencies and many nonprofits like that do is really critical on a side that, like you just said, many people don't see. It's really essential for people as workers to make sure that there are people in these types of agencies and in these types of positions that can highlight the types of things that companies may even inadvertently be doing and policies that may be in place that are not beneficial to workers and that make work a lot less secure, safe, healthy, functional, and so forth. So when we think about, for example, everyday examples of policies that are not beneficial to workers, the data has shown are not beneficial to workers. One example that I like to give is the example of what's called non-compete clauses. And when you talk
Mhm.
about non-compete clauses, these are policies that many companies have into place that initially were designed to protect intellectual property. So if I'm, say, a high-ranking software engineer in a certain company and I know a whole lot of information about this company and the designs that are coming out, if I leave this company and I go to a competitor and I take that information with me, that can be really damaging to the company.
Mhm.
So initially, the idea of a non-compete clause was to say you can't leave this company and go work for a competitor for 6 months or however long. But if I work at Subway and what I'm doing is a job that isn't necessarily paying me enough to make sure that all of my bills are covered, that I don't
Yeah.
have health insurance, that I don't have benefits, which is very common for many workers in those types of jobs, but there's an opportunity for me to move into perhaps a different food service industry job that is going to offer me higher wages, that is going to offer me more benefits, that is going to offer me more financial support. In my view, and in the view of many researchers, it doesn't really make sense to subject workers like that to a non-compete clause. They are not necessarily they don't necessarily have access to the type of proprietary information that's necessarily going to
Right.
cripple Subway as as a franchise or as an industry,
Right.
right? A non-compete clause for a worker like that can mean trapping them in a job that makes sure that they have lower pay, that makes sure that they don't have benefits, that can make sure that they are exposed to persistent sexual harassment. But an increasing number of workers are being subjected to those types of clauses that are keeping them in jobs that that preclude them from being able to move to other opportunities. Now, again, this is not a thing that I think necessarily most people think about or are
Yeah.
aware of. The data show that even workers who are subject to non-compete clauses may not even realize it unless they try to leave a job and the employer decides to enforce it. But people who are in positions in the National Labor Relations Board, people who are in nonprofits who focus on the research into work and what it means for different workers, these are the people who have read the research and they can say, hey, you know what? This type of policy may be getting a little bit out of hand. It may be too widespread. This might not be the type of thing that we want to make sure that we include for workers across the board. When you don't have those people in those jobs, though, it becomes that much easier for companies to make sure, for companies to continue having policies like non-compete clauses, having policies that preclude flexible work arrangements or
Mhm.
remote work or don't provide adequate paid leave or any of the other things that we know from research are pretty commonplace but also very detrimental to many workers. And not having people in positions where they can advocate for those types of changes or even just say this is not necessarily having the intended effect across the board means that even though these agency heads may not be household names, they may not be people whose names you're immediately familiar with. You may think, like you said, what difference does her firing have to do with me? Well, it actually could
That's
have a
right.
lot to do with you when it comes down to her ability to make sure that agency leaders, companies, legislators, and policymakers know the full range of the consequences of the types of policies that are in place.
That is deep because there has been a lot of things happening under the rug. I don't think a lot of people would have even thought about the
Right,
non-compete with something as simple as basic as working at a sandwich shop.
right,
Um, and there's no protection for the everyday worker, and
right.
people don't realize that.
Exactly.
I want to ask you about the pressure on employers to scale back on DEI initiatives too. What I have found fascinating is that, just a side note, people who are saying, yeah, get rid of that DEI, most of them don't even know what those initials mean.
Right.
Um, so let's talk about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Why does it matter? And what does it mean to eliminate initiatives like that in the workplace?
Great question. And I actually want to start answering a question that you didn't actually ask, right? You asked
Okay.
what DEI actually is, and I'm going to say what it actually isn't, because I think
Okay.
that that's
Go for it.
become a misperception that's been very commonplace and
Great
widespread.
point.
Yeah.
Great point.
Because I think there's this understanding that is not supported by data and evidence that when we talk about DEI, this is companies putting into place policies or making decisions where they are just, if I can be frank, letting hordes of unqualified Black workers in the door in jobs that they don't deserve, that they have not
Right.
earned, and that they should not be in, and that ultimately, when they get in those jobs, they operate to the detriment of all involved, right? And I think I'm not even really exaggerating. I think this is the perspective that DEI has come to inaccurately represent. This has become the
Mhm.
mischaracterization of DEI, right? When you hear
Yes.
people say that it should really stand for didn't earn it, right? Often what that implies is this idea that there are just these people, and again, usually
Yeah.
implicitly Black workers, because these are often the people who get pointed to as examples of workers
Yes.
who should not be in certain high ranking professional jobs because they don't deserve to be there, and that they are cutting the line in front of
Hmm.
more qualified, presumably white workers who deserve, who argue, who according to this argument deserve to be in those jobs and were bypassed for them.
Yes.
That's not what DEI actually is or does or means, right? This
Okay.
idea that organizations can simply have a quota system or simply just decide that they're going to hire a certain number of Black people for any job. That's actually been illegal since the 1980s. There was a Supreme Court decision, Backey versus University of California, that explicitly stated that that type of hiring and that type of quota approach was not legal in hiring or in admissions anymore, right?
Mhm.
So what I think you will find in companies is a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced than many people often realize.
Mhm.
For a long time, from I would say around the 80s or 90s up until fairly recently, it was fairly unusual. Sorry, it was fairly normative and unremarkable for companies to embrace diversity and to say that this was something that they believed in and supported. And what we
Mhm.
saw certainly in 2020 was a large number of companies kind of giving a full-throated endorsement of this idea of
Yes.
DEI as something that they believed in and supported. So when
They
companies
spoke
talk
about
about,
it openly, but
oh
let's
my
not talk
gosh,
about
it
the
was all over the place, remember?
Yeah, but not the implementation, but they spoke about it. So,
Yes.
but
And
anyway.
that's the key. That is the key difference. And I'm glad you brought up implementation, because what we've seen is a disconnect between companies saying that they are in favor of DEI and companies actually doing the work of DEI effectively that actually
Mhm.
creates more representation among a variety of different workers. So what we have not seen, despite some naysayers' assertions to the contrary, is companies just bringing in a broad array of unqualified Black workers into high ranking positions. And
Mhm.
if you think I'm lying, you can look at the demographic makeup of workers in pretty much any industry. And if you look at the top
Yes.
levels, it is uniformly, pretty consistently very homogenous, right? You don't see an overrepresentation of Black workers in those types of jobs, which you would if Black people were just being hired in mass into those positions, right?
Right.
So when we're talking about what DEI actually is, when it's done correctly, what it refers to is this idea that companies can think broadly and expansively and widely about how they cultivate a fully equipped and fully thriving workforce. And that
Mhm.
includes things like how they can make sure that they're structuring their hiring procedures in such a way that incorporates the widest hiring pool possible. It includes thinking about advancement protocols, making sure that there are pathways in place so that all workers have opportunities to move into higher ranking positions. It includes things like thinking about the organizational culture of a workplace and making sure that it's as supportive as possible for, again, a variety of workers. What many people may not realize when I say a variety of workers, that doesn't just include Black people, right?
Yes. Thank you. Please elucidate on
Yes.
who that includes.
Yes, because when we're talking about DEI, like I said, there is the mischaracterization that this is kind of a Black thing. But when
That's right.
companies are doing DEI correctly, they are talking about Black workers, and they are also talking about women of all races. They are
Yep.
talking about workers who are veterans. They are talking about
Yes.
workers who are older. They are talking about workers who come from any number of protected classes, workers who may have neurological, who may be neurodivergent, workers who may be differently abled. All of these groups are included when diversity work is done effectively in this banner, because these are
Yes.
all groups who are members of protected classes, and these are all groups who we know from extensive research may not necessarily have the connections, the relationships, the resources, the types of sociological processes that lead to success and inclusion in workplaces. And that's
Mhm.
not because these workers don't have the skills, the experience, the education, the qualifications, anything like that. What they often are lacking are the relationships outside of work. They are often lacking the growing up in a country club that tells you
Mhm.
how to play golf and know the norms and the nuances of navigating a corporate space. What they may be missing are the mentors who can pull them aside and
Yes.
say, "Hey, make sure that you get assigned to this particular project because this is going to be a key one that that determines who moves into this vice presidential role next cycle that we're
Mhm.
doing hiring." Those are the
But
types of things. Oh, go ahead.
no, but I was going to say, no, you're absolutely right. But Professor, what about people who say, well, why do we even need that diversity? If they were qualified, what does it matter? They should get it themselves.
Yes, I'm so glad that you asked that because part of what we know from research is that a lot of how people move into jobs, particularly high ranking jobs, is not exclusively based on qualifications.
Hmm.
Networks matter enormously. Connections matter enormously. And what we know when we talk about hiring, for example, research shows that when companies have tried to diversify their hiring pools, when they go outside of the typical channels that they often use, going to certain Ivy League colleges or Ivy League adjacent colleges and include historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, what they find are enormous numbers of qualified, motivated, hungry, talented workers that are fantastic. And they jump at hiring these people. The only difference is they did not know about those workers to begin with, and they
Yes.
didn't have the connections and the ties to those workers. And that's what I mean when I talk about the more social aspects of how we work, that it's not just a matter of qualifications, it's also a matter of knowing who to know and knowing how to get your foot in the door. The other part of your question, when it comes to why this matters and why we should care in the first place, is that from a corporate standpoint, for companies, having more diversity actually improves revenues, it improves innovation. Companies that are more diverse are stronger, better equipped, and more innovative and have higher revenues than those that are not. And that's been shown across a variety of studies, and a lot of data supports that. So it's really to the benefit of workers to have more access to opportunities within jobs, but it's also beneficial to companies to make sure that they are as innovative as possible, that they are bringing in as many people as possible who can relate back to their mission, who can help serve organizational goals, and who can help really help companies achieve their financial and their overall goals of what they're trying to gain in corporate spaces.
Mhm. And when we talk, and I appreciate you mentioning that because when you talk about bringing people in, let's say, okay, we get the folks in there. Now there's some reluctance about actually having them there.
Yeah.
And a while back, you were on All Things Considered, and you and the panel were talking about the wage disparity that happens. It still exists for people of color and their white counterparts. And this was more than 10 years ago. There
Yep.
was this conversation about the wage gap, and it still exists. There's been very little change in the wage gap. Can you talk about that? Why is this still a problem?
Yeah. So what we find with the wage gap is that that refers to this process where for Black workers, even having more education does not necessarily mean that that closes racial gaps between them and their white counterparts. And
Hmm.
people may say, well, maybe the problem is something else. Maybe that they are not as experienced, or maybe they're just
Hmm.
underperforming, or what have you. But the trick with research is that it allows us to control for all of those variables. And so what research
Yes.
shows is that even when all of those things are held constant, if we're talking about Black and white workers where they have the same levels of experience, the same levels of education, the same commitments to the job, the same job performance, and so forth, when all those things are held constant and the only difference is education, then we're still seeing that Black workers are still experiencing these wage gaps. They still are being underpaid relative to their white counterparts. Now, there are a
Hmm.
lot of factors that can play into that, but I think that some of it has to do with the ways that companies assess workers and the ways that companies make determinations, particularly some managers make determinations about how they are going to assign compensation. I'm thinking
Yes.
specifically of research by my colleague Emilio Castillo, who's at MIT, and he's written some work recently that shows that ironically, the more companies commit on paper to this idea of meritocracy, the more we are likely to see gaps between white workers and other underrepresented workers. That's shocking, right? Because you
Yeah,
would think,
yeah.
how
Why? How
could,
does that
how,
work?
right, exactly. You would think that makes no sense. If it is a
Right.
meritocratic space, why would we still see those gaps? And so, what these researchers find is that when companies identify themselves as meritocracies and they stop there, they become less likely to be internally attuned to potential biases that may occur among managers. They think this is a meritocratic place. We don't have those issues anymore. We're fair and everything's fine. And without kind of doing these internal audits, without checking internally, without being reflexive, then it becomes a lot easier for biases to creep into these hiring processes, into these promotion processes, into these salary compensations and assignments. And that is how the idea of meritocracy actually allows for inequalities to grow within these workplaces. Because when people think it's a meritocracy, they stop being self-aware essentially, and they stop being reflexive about the things that they may be doing to make their organizations less of a meritocracy. The good news is that these researchers found that when companies not necessarily dropped that language, but when they adopted it with more self-reflexive measures and made sure that managers remembered and that employees remembered, we still have to be attuned for ways that biases might creep into the process, then people were more likely to do exactly that. But I think that it's processes like these ideas that we can just feel comfortable and we don't really have to do anything. We can rest on our laurels. We can just pick up this label of meritocracy and we'll be fine. And that's the right thing to do because we want to be a meritocracy. In some ways, that is the right thing to do. But if we do that prematurely and if we do it without the structures in place that allow us to actually get there, then we don't actually achieve this meritocracy and we end up with the types of wage gaps that you and I are talking about.
That is so significant that you mentioned that, because when there is an attitude of, well, you're here, what's the big
Yes.
deal? I think there are plenty of people who have had that experience. That being said, you're talking about research, and I want to circle back to certain um, elements of the workforce that have been dismantled. And there's a broader issue of reporting diversity in the workforce. I think it's the EEO1 Workforce Diversity Reporting System that has been targeted at, dismantled, if not already. There are plans for it to be dismantled. And tell me if I'm understanding this correctly, they would track some of the things that you're talking about right now. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that is correct. Yes, that is
Okay.
correct. And that's a big part of why dismantling that is such a huge mistake. And I can say,
Yeah.
as a researcher, the information that I've given to you today is based on data and research and evidence that has been peer reviewed. It's gone through data analysis, it's gone through trials and testing and so forth. But we need data and evidence to know what's working and what's not working,
Right.
where groups are overrepresented, where groups are underrepresented, and why those patterns occur. And you cannot do that effectively if you don't have data to look at and analyze and measure in the first place. So it's really a huge loss not to have access to that type of information.
What happens then? What happens now? Is that entity gone? And what happens? What recourse do people have?
Yeah. So in terms of people like me who are researchers who want to understand what's happening, we're really crippled without that type of infrastructure in place. There are efforts I think that people are taking to try to collect this data as much as they can on their own, but it just doesn't necessarily replace or have the same effect, I think, as the type of fully throated, more comprehensive databases that we are accustomed to working with. So you get what you can use and you kind of draw data and analysis based on that. But I live in a world where I like data, I like research, I like analysis and
Yeah.
understanding and knowing what's going on. Having some of that is useful, having more of it is better. And so we're at a place where I think in the research community doing what we can with what we have, but knowing also that what we have is not what it was, and that
Mhm.
having more information, having more comprehensive data, having more research gives us the tools that we need to be able to offer the best conclusions that we can, and that we're not in a place where without that data we're able to make arguments that are as comprehensive as they otherwise could be.
So there is going to be a hole for over the
Yeah.
next however amount of time, months, maybe years.
Yeah.
How do you cover that gap? How do you even do that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what will end up happening is many researchers using the information that they do have to draw what conclusions that they
Okay.
can, right? So for me, my research doesn't tend to rely on EEOC data or EEO1 data. I tend to do a more of an interviewing strategy where I spend a lot of time with
Okay.
people and try to understand their work experiences in certain jobs and try to look at patterns in that data. So for researchers like me, I'll still be able to contribute, I hope, and to create studies that I think have some
Okay.
utility along these lines. But I also try to draw a lot from colleagues, right? And it's useful for
Okay.
me to be able to say, here's what my colleague who does rely on this large data set has shown. And here's
Mhm.
how my work fits into that picture. If you think of the research picture as kind of a puzzle, we still, I think, have a lot of pieces in place, but there are still pieces that are missing. And without all of the pieces in place, you can get the image, but it's not as complete and it's not as comprehensive and it's not as all encompassing as you would like it to be.
Understood. What's nice though is that your colleagues represent other pieces too, and you can at
Yes.
least put something together that the
Yeah.
layperson can use. That being said, I'm really encouraged when I hear you talk about talking to other people about what their lived experience is. And I always like to end my program on a hopeful note in terms of what can the average person do? Let's talk about the person who has a job and they may not know what protections they have. They may be experiencing microaggressions. Where do they go? What are three top tips you would tell someone to do who wants to feel empowered, wants to know what their rights are, and just wants to know how they can get through their day to day?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would say to people, to the extent possible, and I know that time is a factor and issue for everybody, right?
Yeah.
But to the extent possible, look around and see what information you can gather about what's happening in your workplace, in your job, to people who are in the types of profession that you're in, whether that's looking at podcasts like yours or articles or books or blog posts or whatever. Look around and see what information you can gather about what the nature of your workplace is and what you're experiencing. The second thing that I think is really important and critical is for individuals not to act alone if they don't have
Mhm.
to. We know from so much history that people are more effective when they are in groups than when they are individuals. And one of the things that I've learned from my own research is that a lot of the people that I speak to really do feel very isolated. They think, this
Mhm.
is the thing that's just happening to me, or, maybe this is all in my head because I don't see anyone else like me at my workplace. And maybe this is just a unique thing that's happening to me. And I have to tell them in many cases, it's actually not. What you're experiencing is so common that it has a name. This is something that's documented in research and it's very common to people in your position, in your profession. You're not alone. It's not just you. But that feeling of being alone can be very isolating, but it can also make it harder to make a group effort to say, here's the issue that we're experiencing, and this is
Yeah.
why this is a problem. And the next thing that I would say after that is when feasible and possible to think about what routes are available to try to change workplaces. In some professions, it may be working with a union. Every
Mhm.
profession is not unionized, so that may not be a realistic option. But in other cases, it may involve collectively presenting a case to leadership, to management. It may mean going outside of institutional channels and working with elected officials or making sure that elected officials know here's an issue that we are experiencing in this job and this is something that you can do about it. This is something that you should care about as it affects your constituents. But I think these questions of one, knowing what issues are prevalent for your job or your profession or your workplace, connecting with other workers to make sure that there's a bigger voice in numbers, and then taking that pathway to the relevant outlets, whether it's internal to the organization or external to the organization. I think those are things that anyone is capable and able to do. And again, I say that with the caveat we all have a million things to do. People have families and, work can be exhausting. But I also think that there are ways that we can change the work environments that we have, again, to make them more fair and equitable and fulfilling and rewarding for all of us. And I think everyone deserves that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so, so much, Professor. This has been hugely helpful. Where can we find you? Do you have any writings you want to guide us to, or where can we find you if we want to learn more about you?
Sure. So actually, I submit a column for Forbes.com. So if you if you go to my Forbes.com page, you can actually click a link to follow,
Mhm.
and that will update you every time I have a new column that comes out. And so people can get that consistently.
That is terrific. What's the name of your page?
So it's just a column that comes out under my name. So there's no specific page, but I try to update it regularly each month. So March columns have not posted yet, but they should be going up pretty soon.
Okay, so if someone goes to Forbes.com and just put your name in there, they'll
Yep,
find. All right,
exactly. Yeah.
terrific. That's wonderful. Uh, Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, pleasure's been mine. And now it's time to recap Professor Harvey Wingfield's top power plays. First, she says gather as much information, credible information, as you can in your workplace, particularly when it comes to knowing your rights.
Also, she says, don't act alone if you're facing a hardship. You and your team members should join together and go to leadership, or work with a union if you have one. And finally, she says, if necessary, go outside and reach out to an elected official. And if you want to learn more about Professor Harvey Wingfield's column, go to Forbes.com and spell out her name, AdiaHarvey-Wingfield. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you're feeling a little more hopeful, a little less stuck, and maybe even inspired to take action, because democracy does work when we all participate. And don't forget, sign up for our newsletter to get updates on when our next episode drops. You can go to my website, democracydoes.com. And as a bonus, if you haven't gotten one, a free and easy tip sheet on how to get involved.